Pleasure to have all of you here this afternoon. As you can hear, I'm having a little throat situation, so I am not going to talk much more. What I'm going to do is turn you over to the very capable hands of our program director, Ms. Jennifer Franklin.
So nice to see such a big crowd today for Edward Hirsch and Emily Fragos. We want to thank them, of course, for coming, and thank all of you for being here. We just have a couple of quick business things to get out of the way first before we start the reading. We are very pleased to tell you that Nick Flynn will be reading here with Kathy Ossop on December 6th. So please come out again for that reading. It's going to be great. We have a lot of upcoming events, and there is a brochure you can take with you. They're on your chairs, so check that out. We also have our annual gala that is going to take place at Tappan Hill on November 5th. It's a Thursday, and there are still tickets available, so we'd love to see some of you come out for that. As always, we would like to thank our sponsors. We are so lucky to have funding from Arts Westchester and funding from the New York State Council of the Arts, the Bidell Foundation, and the David G. Taft Foundation. We want to thank them for their generous support. And thank all of you for being members of the Hudson Valley Writers Center and for coming out, supporting our readings, supporting our classes. We are really thrilled to have all of you here tonight. Really is the event of the year for us, so we're so excited to see all of you. I'm going to start right in on my introduction for my good friend Emily Fragos. It's a pleasure for me to welcome my friend Emily Fragos to the Hudson Valley Writers Center. I have known Emily since 1994 when we were graduate students at Columbia. Fragos is an award-winning, widely published poet who teaches poetry workshops at NYU and Columbia. She is the author of 2 books of poetry, Little Savage and Hostage, New and Selected Poems. Her work has appeared in every one of the finest poetry publications in the country, including Best American Poetry, The New Yorker, Poetry, APR, the Paris Review, Boston Review, and most recently, Poem a Day on Poets.org from the Academy of American Poets. She is the editor of 5 poetry anthologies from Every Man's Pocket Library from Knopf. She is the recipient of several national awards, including a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry. In graduate school, I was lucky enough to witness our teachers discover and nurture her singular and extraordinary talent. In class, the other students all knew that we were in the presence of a great poet when she brought an early version of her poem called Pompeii, AD 79, a few weeks into the first semester. Its omniscient and empathetic voice moved us all. It has been a joy for me to see Fragos' work and career blossom over the past 2 decades. The salient feature of her work is her compassion towards her varied subjects and towards animals and the natural world. Her poems are full of sentiment without ever being sentimental. A serious student of poetry and literature in general, one can observe her love of Shakespeare, Rilke, Merwin, and Dickinson in the musicality of her language and in her subject matter, but Fragos has a voice entirely her own. She is a poetic visionary. One comes away from her work believing he or she has seen the world anew from her omniscient perspective. Her poems are riddled with ruin, waste, suffering, milk that drips unused from a mother's breast, dancers past their prime, knees that need surgery, dying loved ones. Yet, there is a great deal of hope and beauty juxtaposed with sadness and damage. In an interview that I did with Fragos in Upstreet in 2013, she says this of Dickinson, but it could easily apply to Fragos' work as well. Quote, she gives us solace in hard times. She hands us a balm, B-O-M-B, and we are calmed because we are not alone anymore. She is a courage artist. Please help me welcome Emily Fragos.
Thank you so much for that astonishing introduction. I thank the people at the Hudson Valley Writers Center for setting up this wonderful event. And I thank Jennifer Franklin, who's not just a poet, but an instructor of poetry, but also, you may not know this, a very powerful advocate for children with disabilities. She does a tremendous amount of good for people, many, many people, through her poetry and through her life, through her example. And I certainly thank someone I admire just about more than anyone else, the great poet Edward Hirsch. It is an incredible honor to appear with Edward Hirsch on the same podium. This is one of our truly great poets of the English language. We live in a time of such hyperbole. Everything is a masterpiece. Everybody's great. Everybody's right. It's not really true. It's just the age we live in. But there are, every now and then, you get the real deal. And Edward Hirsch is one of our great voices, our great poets. Great. Here he is over there, greatly honored. I know that Edward Hirsch has written some of the greatest ekphrastic poems of our time. My particular favorite is The Horizontal Line, homage to Agnes Martin, which is a veritable masterpiece. I can't compete with that, nor do I wish to, but I think I will also start with some ekphrastic poems. Those are poems that are inspired by works of art, or about works of art, or simply a work of art that inspired a certain emotion. So I'll start there. This is called Goya's Mirth, and it's based on a drawing, one of the great drawings by Goya. I'll describe it to you just briefly. There are two very old and very desiccated people. They're dancing insanely in the middle of the air, in a gravityless air. And it is heartbreaking and hilarious and heartwarming and crazy, and it has pathos and has all the things that the great Goya can put into one drawing. This is my take on it, just one angle. Goya's Mirth. 1. Can you hear them shrieking? The filthy witch and the crackly skinned insect slurping potato soup and rising from the table of crusted ladles to dance, leaping in midair, kicking grief in the fat gut. 2. Who stinks here? It is I, Lord, reeking under these heavy, misshapen clothes. The world waves a fan in front of its nose. It is the cancer. It is the dying off. It is I, your foul, offensive lady, your mossy rock. I have a need to stop it, but I cannot. 3. Push your cart up and down the street. No one sees you, Mémère, but you are safe here in Francisco's wild drawing. Forget the words. Forget the worms. A dog's scrap rolls under the table and is forgotten. The dog? You will die with him soon. Not too long ago, I discovered the poetry of the Swiss writer Robert Walser. Up and down the street. His dates are 1878 to 1956. He's mostly known as a prose writer, I think. But I discovered his poetry and liked it so much. In spite of a very difficult life, he was a man who felt great empathy. His poems are often quite radiant. He's full of enjoyment for life and for the world. He seems to have lived quite naturally, beyond good and bad, beyond happy and sad. I guess the Zen Buddhists call that a spirit. He seemed to have had naturally this spirit. And I so admire that. I certainly wish I were more like that myself. It's something I aspire to. And the quote in this poem, which is on Robert Walser, is one of his famous quotes. It says, "To be small and to stay small." And in the arts, you get a lot of very kind of ambitious people with kind of unfettered ego and ambition and competition and envy, and it's exhausting sometimes in the arts. And when I read that line by Walser, I said, how lovely, how reassuring that one can just go about one's work and enjoy one's work. I guess the Native Americans say it. They say there are many paths you can take to get to the same destination. So Walser seems to have found a very radiant path to his life's meaning. On Robert Walser. You saw a dwarf and imagined yourself dwarf. Or the old homeless hag pushing her garbage. You closed your eyes for days at a time, groping along the village walls, tumbling into bushes with an embarrassed gasp. You adored the gentle woman, her shapely bum, and the chattering birds with faces like walnuts and feet like twigs, so alive, alert, and active in their birdie pursuits. Standing alone in your stale, furnished room, you felt a shudder of feather, and the glowing air grew full, so close. Oh, to be alive was wonderful, but to be small and to stay small, drop of water into the water. I didn't realize I'd chosen so many drastic poems. A lot of, I won't, my poems are short and I will be brief too. This poem is called After Dürer, and it was inspired by the famous drawing of Melancholia by Albrecht Dürer. And I wanted to dedicate it to my friend, Professor Stacy Pies at NYU. Stacy has been very ill for a very long time, and I didn't think she would pull through, but she did. She's still ill, but not as ill as before. And I told her, I'm going to dedicate this poem to you, and she wrote me back a very funny email. She said, well, I didn't do anything. Don't dedicate the poem to me. All I did was get sucky cancer. That's what she wrote back. She said, but please dedicate it to my doctor, because he's the person. He's very compassionate, and he saved my life. I don't know if Dr. Jeffrey Tepler is here tonight. I was told he might be here. But so this is for Dr. Tepler and his patient, Stacy Pies. They go together. After Dürer. As when icy illness ends, that you never expected could possibly end, and the terrified body, enveloped in warm water, reposes, You could kiss every child on the hand, every leaf in the forest, every stone of the wall. A low moan escapes the mouth. Melancholia, the accompanying spirit, is departing with her ratty wings and her crusted eyes, her suitcase of rocks. A shy, small creature steps trembling from the brush. I saw a photograph from the Robert Scott expedition to the South Pole in 1912. And it so stunned me, I did a double, triple take. They brought ponies with them to the South Pole. You may know this story. They weren't the first expedition to bring ponies to the poles. There had been an expedition before, but they had been a different kind, different breed of pony with heavier. But the Scott expedition made so many mistakes, one after the next after the next. Some of it just by accident, some by pure arrogance. And they brought, like, pony ride ponies from England to the South Pole. Of course, this is a famous, disastrous expedition. Not just for the dogs and the horses, but the poor men, the people involved. And they didn't get there first after all of that. The Norwegians beat them by several weeks. But I looked at this photograph and I was just stunned. I submitted this poem to the New Republic, and it was taken. It was published last year. And at that time, the poetry editor was Henri Cole, a wonderful poet. And I'd only seen the one photograph, and he was so intrigued by the poem that he went online and he sent me about, half a dozen photographs of the expedition and the ponies. And so at the same time we were looking at them on our respective laptops, and I really did have tears in my eyes, and I wrote him that. I said, I can't even look at this, it's so sad. And he wrote back, me too, I have tears in my eyes. Very rarely do you have this kind of rapport, connection with a poetry editor at a journal. Usually it's just rejected, get lost. But I thank Henri Cole, because we started looking at these photographs and talking about this poem and other poems. And it was so illuminating for me to have that sudden connection to the usual invisible. I've never met Henri Cole, but he certainly praise him for his kindness. This poem originally was so long, and I was telling all the details and the story, and then I said, this is such baloney. You don't need all this, It's, to honor this experience, it should be stark, minimal, spare, not all this baggage, this verbiage, this, and so I took everything out, and in the end I actually said to myself, gee, the whole poem is in the title, Ponies at the South Pole. I did write the poem after that wonderful title. Doesn't that stop you in your tracks? Ponies at the South Pole? It's like, is she mad? I'm not mad. Scott was bad. Ponies at the South Pole after a photograph, Scott Expedition 1912. I might add the quote is Scott's final quote in his diary. Ponies at the South Pole. They are quieter than quiet. They are colder than cold can be imagined. They may very well be blind. Their ears receive the last sensation, a tiny crumble of nothing. Their oblong heads tilt toward each other. The end cannot be far, writes the bungling, stubborn man in his battered white tent. Writes suffering, bungling man. I have a poem about, put this here. There's nothing worse than somebody who hogs that microphone. I always keep a close look on my watch. I think I'll read one more ekphrastic poem. It's an odd one by a very odd outsider artist. I like the outside, some of them, not all of them. Emma Hauck, the letters of Emma Hauck. I'll give you the little footnote to help you understand. Emma Hauck was committed in 1909 Germany for schizophrenia. She wrote many letters to her husband saying only, "Sweetheart, come." Hundreds of thousands of times, overlapping on top of each other. No letters were ever delivered. Her letters are now very world famous examples of outsider art and swarm art. I didn't even know there was such a term, but that is a good description of what these letters look like. I've seen them in a gallery. They're unbelievable. They swarm, they flow, they move like water, they are elusive, they are heartbreaking, they are beautiful. In one of them, she seems to be climbing little steps, little rungs right off of the page, going up, up, up. And they're just unbelievable, and they are utterly unique in the world of art. I saw them in a gallery, and everyone, I wasn't the only one mesmerized. Everyone was just looking at them. And after a while, she didn't even write sweetheart, she just wrote one word, come. Koma. If I'm pronouncing it right in German, K-O-M-M-E. And if you look very closely, you can actually make out the letters, but they're overlapped, piled on, you know. And I noticed that from a lot of the poems that I chose, they're somehow about people who feel some kind of entrapment, or whether through illness or being taken literally hostage or abandonment, and who have found somehow or not found some release, some escape, some ladder up, 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 up. And I like to think that this person found some consolation. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer, but that's how I view this strange phenomenon. The letters of Emma Hauck. Come, the curdling word, the black ladder that tears a hole through the asylum's roof, troposphere, stratosphere, to make for us our own anesthesia, lullaby, and good night, sweet love. Pleased to wear rags around the mouth and nose, to contain the last essence from seeping, weighted down by gauze just barely, to keep us here by what kind of what? Some poems about music. Everybody loves music, and these are a little brighter. I used to play piano pretty well and cello pretty well. I can't anymore. But there was a time when I loved Chopin because they were so free. Even though they were strict according to the rules of the composition, there seemed to be an enormous freedom in the music. And so 19 Chopin waltzes. Snow falls from rafters of pink, swollen clouds. Moonlight drenches the peasants' fields. The feathered flesh of a fish, the juice of a peach, the silver rivers before we name them with color. All the begetting, the weak limbs and soft bellies, The face is elongated like the devil himself, the devil himself. The ship that sails to dreams of Achilles, the palace of the deaf. The murmuring in centuries' rooms, the crying of turtle doves, oh, the fleet-footed dancing. On earth as in heaven, beauty without reason. I used to love to play Bach on the cello. Now they use it for all the TV commercials. They sell toilet paper with Bach cello suite #1. They sell Charmin toilet paper. Bach fugue. A few things. This is a litany poem trying to capture the power and of the music, which ultimately you cannot do. You just have to go to the music. But there are two things in this poem that are stops on an organ, the instrument, the organ. One is swell to great, which is just what it says. Start low, and then you swell to that great rocks the walls. You've heard the organ go all the way to great. The roof starts to shake. And the other stop, I think there are like 54, 64 stops. I don't know. I don't remember, but I just used two. Celestial tremulous is just what it sounds like. Light, airy, celestial. Gloucester is a character in King Lear. What else do I have to? I'll just read it. Bach fugue. Frees the horses from their mechanical bolts, keeps the fire from spreading to the sleeper's floor. The miming dances in the wings swell to great, begin their sly whisperings, their tired arms around each other's waist. The old woman spoons yellow cake into her mouth, is capable of putting poor Gloucester's eyes glistening back, catches the jumpers with invisible nets from their sad night bridges, finds all those who have been lost to you. I'll read two more music poems. They're both brief. Since I just did Bach, I think I'll read a poem about Glenn Gould, the great Bach pianist. Gould, of course, was known for being obsessive compulsive, having all kinds of compulsions. The title is from the headline of the New York Times, Glenn Gould, dead at 50. It is darker where I am. I cannot tell, holding my hand over one eye, if it is female there. At 6, I multiplied endlessly and began to feel close to sacrifice. The music took root inside of me like torture, all tension, retard, release. It is in every part of my body now, and there is not room left for me. I have burned all my gapes. I have got rid of all my papers. And one more music poem. I chose this poem in honor of Edward Hirsch, because this poem is about joy, the joy that music can instill in us. And the end of this poem has a young novitiate, and she's so elated, so ecstatically happy that she's rushing across a slick floor. And Edward Hirsch has been so generous that he has brought to my life. I'm forever grateful to him. The Scarlatti Sun, S-U-N. The mute seamstress on her knees sticks a pin in the hem and weeps for the cloth. The dead stop their dying, their heads warming like stones in the Scarlatti sun. The grave postman, his worn leather bag strapped to his back, feels his mind go windswept. A woman at her window, her old cat on the sill, sips thick coffee from a saucer And in the shuttered convent, the novitiate, taken up, rushes across the just washed floor, daring the ground to break a bone. That's joy, right? That's happiness. I'm going to end with 2 poems about animals. I think I'll do these 2. I'd like to dedicate this poem to one of our great poets, Mark Strand. Mark Strand and I were colleagues at Columbia, although I never got to see him at Columbia because his door would open and he would start running. Running down the hall, running down the steps, running off the campus. He did not like teaching. He would send me the most hilarious emails I think I've ever gotten in my life because we taught right next to each other. They would just have me cracking up. One day he did come out of his room. I came out of mine. He said, "Emily, come here. Do you want to read a great poem that nobody's ever heard of?" And I said, "Yes, definitely." He gave me a poem called A Prayer to Go to Paradise with the Donkeys. He's absolutely right. No one has ever heard of it. It is by the French naturalist poet Francis Jammes, Jammes. It's by far the greatest poem he ever wrote. And it is a wonderful, wonderful poem. It is reverential and tender-hearted and sad and sweet. It is just an incredible poem. It inspired me to write a poem about donkeys, of which I know this. But I know that they're mistreated. And so I imagined a poem about donkeys. I miss Mark Strand very much. Here was another one of our great, truly great American poets. A lovely man. Beast of Burden for Mark Strand. Piled so high the legs buckle. Hit with a thin stick, whistled at, shouted at, kicked with their heels. End me on this earth with these humans, under a boiling sun in a world of rocks. Remove the tower of wooden collar studded with bells from around my thick neck, so that removed from all halters I may wander. Let the dust blow me away to quiet, long roads, the clip-clop of my feet, the only music I hear. Or let me be gently led like the old, or pull the wooden carts of babies, and nothing more. Lord of the ass, lay me down unencumbered in your green pastures for which they incessantly pray. The air cooling and petting the bones of my ears, brushing my skull, the still waters washing out my braying mouth. This is my final poem. It's another animal poem. It started as an animal poem, but it morphs into a poem about, started as a poem about abandoned and abused animals, but it morphs into a poem about people. So, both. I dedicate this poem, my final dedication of the night, is for William S. Merwin, who has written the most beautiful poems about his chow-chows. Please, if you haven't read the poems about his beautiful chow-chows, and the other poems too, but the chow-chows are just wonderful. The Black Dog, In the Name of Air, 2 of my favorites. And so I dedicate this dog poem to William S. Merwin. Hostage. God is in the dogs, the one who turns in circles, the one with scabs, the one who wears the collar, who stares and stares and tries in spite of it to smell the dirt and grass. In the abandonment, torrential muteness, my knees loosened, my glassy eyes of crystals warmed, and it was given. Even should we sleep, turn, weep, recite, screaming, the city is conquered, and the little king will have to go, insane and unreachable. We are still here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Can you guys imagine being in class with her as a student and sitting around the table and hearing poems like this? Thank you, Emily, for that beautiful reading.
Thank you for having me.
It's amazing. I am honored to welcome the esteemed Edward Hirsch to the Hudson Valley Writers Center. My students and I have been waiting for this afternoon for most of 2015. I was first introduced to Hirsch's poetry by his friend and my mentor, Richard Howard, 21 years ago when I was a graduate student at Columbia, and I have admired his work ever since. As all of you know, Edward Hirsch is one of the finest poets writing in English today. As a poet and as a scholar of poetry, his creative and critical collections are among the finest books written over the past 4 decades. Described by Peter Stitt in poetry as, quote, a poet of genuine talent and feeling, Hirsch was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award for his first volume, For the Sleepwalkers. His second, Wild Gratitude, won the award in 1987. What a title. Students, take note of that title. He's been awarded fellowships and prizes, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation, and received a MacArthur Genius Award. Hirsch is now president of the Guggenheim Foundation and is a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. How to read a poem and fall in love with poetry, Poet's Choice, and a Poet's Glossary are beloved studies for the uninitiated and experts alike. The Living Fire, New and Selected Poems, 1972 to 2010. All of these books are on sale here. Shows, according to Peter Campion in the New York Times, quote, what makes Hirsch so singular in American poetry is the balance he strikes between the quotidian and something completely other, an irrational counterforce. Here is just one example of what I think Campion means by this. It's from his poem, Scorched. 3 p.m., the hour of scorched absences, the hour when the city slumps like a widow, and a dogged couple in their 30s is forever trying to wring a child from the clamor of each other's bodies in a small pension of the old quarter. Look at them, breathing against each other in the hour of silences, the hour of nothing violated and nothing affirmed, of pleasure mixed with the fire of grief. Evan Bolin described Hirsch's most recent book of poems, Gabriel, as a masterpiece of sorrow. On a personal note, Gabriel is the most painful and moving book of poetry that I have ever read. We want to thank you again for coming to read for us today. Please help me welcome the incomparable Edward Hirsch.
So glad to be with you. Listening to Emily and Jennifer, I had a moment where I actually felt so good about myself. It passed rapidly. I couldn't hold on to it. But I'd really like to meet that guy. He sounds like I know better, though. I know better. Anyway, wonderful reading. Emily's poems they're so unlikely, really. I've always admired this about them. They start in such odd ways. You think you don't really need a poem like that, and then when you're done reading it, you think you couldn't live without it. They have a kind of inevitability about them, and really, I think, a deep, humane compassion. So, when Jennifer wanted me to read, and she asked who I wanted to read with most, I said it was Emily. That because she said, well, one thing about the reading is you'll come on the train, you'll pay for yourself. money. Really, it's a great reading. It's a great reading series. You'll pay us, but really, it'll be good. That's how I feel. Absolutely, she's right. I'm going to begin with a poem called To Poetry. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Lost Weekend. It's about an alcoholic writer who doesn't write. That's where this starts. To Poetry. Don't desert me just because I stayed up last night watching The Lost Weekend. I know I've spent too much time praising your naked body to strangers and gossiping about lovers you betrayed. I've stalked you in foreign cities and followed your far-flung movements, pretending I could describe you. Forgive me for getting jacked on coffee and obsessing over your features year after jittery year. I'm sorry for handing you a line and typing you on a screen, but don't let me suffer in silence. Does anyone still invoke the muse, string a wooden lyre for Apollo, or try to saddle up Pegasus? Winged horse, heavenly god or goddess, indifferent entity, secret code, stored magic, pleasance and half wonder. Hell, I've loved you my entire life without even knowing what you are or how. Please help me to find you. This is called Black Rhinoceros. The black rhinoceros at Brookfield Zoo, eating sweet potatoes, carrots, and bread, looked like my uncle's extended family crowding around the table at Thanksgiving. Mrs. Mulvihill suddenly started crying on the second grade bus, which often stalled. And the next day we had a substitute teacher who said that rhinos have poor eyesight and swivel their tube-shaped ears in all directions so they can hear their enemies approaching, lions and people who carve their horns into daggers or mash them into pain relievers. My parents bought my shoes on discount at Walensky and Levy, and so whenever I raised either foot, my soul said, damaged. That's why I kept my feet close to the floor. When Mrs. Mulvihill returned, she wore dark dresses and told us that the black rhinoceros is the same muddy color as the white rhinoceros, which is strange if you think about it. And we did. What does it feel like to have two horns tilting up on a huge head, Mr. Rhinoceros? You lumber around in your skin of armor like an exiled general or a grounded unicorn. Everyone knows that a pachyderm in peril would still rather live in the open savanna. We can't tell if you're trumpeting forward or backward in your scrubby house. Cotton candy. We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time, and I ate cotton candy, that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more, but I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers through the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. This is called Branch Library. I'm trying in this poem to get back to the feeling I had when I first started writing poetry, when I was moving between the stacks where I was reading and the tables where I was writing. Branch Library. I wish I could find that skinny, long-beaked boy who perched in the branches of the old Branch Library. He spent the Sabbath flying between the wobbly stacks and the flimsy wooden tables on the second floor, pecking at nuts, nesting in broken spines, scratching notes under his own corner patch of sky. I'd give anything to find that birdie boy again, bursting out into the dusky blue afternoon with his satchel of scrawls and scribbles, radiating heat, singing with joy. Self-portrait. I live between my heart and my head, like a married couple who can't get along. I live between my left arm, which is swift and sinister, and my right, which is righteous. I live between a laugh and a scowl, and voted against myself, a two-party system. My left leg dawdled or danced along, my right cleaved to the straight and narrow. My left shoulder was like a stripper on vacation. My right stood upright as a Roman soldier. Let's just say that my left side was the organ donor, and leave my private parts alone. But as for my eyes, which are two shades of brown, well, Dionysus, meet Apollo. Look at Eve raising her left eyebrow while Adam puts his right foot down. No one expected it to survive, but divorce seemed out of the question. I suppose my left hand and my right hand will be clasped over my chest in the coffin, and I'll be reconciled at last. I'll be whole again. This is called a partial history of my stupidity. You get to be a certain age and you just can't do the whole thing anymore. So this is like volume 3, chapter 5. Traffic was heavy coming off the bridge, and I took the road to the right, the wrong one, and got stuck in the car for hours. Most nights I rushed out into the evening without paying attention to the trees, whose names I didn't know, or the birds, which flew heedlessly on. I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along, like a tiger that wanted to spring, but was still afraid of the wildness within. The iron bars seemed invisible to others, but I carried a cage around inside me. I cared too much what other people thought and made remarks I shouldn't have made. I was silent when I should have spoken. Forgive me, philosophers. I read the Stoics, but never understood them. I felt that I was living the wrong life, spiritually speaking. While halfway around the world, thousands of people were being slaughtered, some of them by my countrymen. So I walked on, distracted, lost in thought, and forgot to attend to those who suffered far away, nearby. Forgive me, faith, for never having any. I did not believe in God, who eluded me. This is an elegy for my father, who was a box salesman. He liked special orders rather than standard orders because he got paid more. And also it was more imaginative for him because he could design the boxes himself. So this is called special orders. Give me back my father, walking the halls of Wertheimer Box and Paper Company with sawdust clinging to his shoes. Give me back his tape measure and his keys, his drafting pencil and his order forms. Give me his daydreams on lined paper. I don't understand this uncontainable grief. Whatever you had that never fit, whatever else you needed, believe me, my father, who wanted your business, would squat down at your side and sketch you a container for it. Self-portrait. I live between my heart and my head, like a married couple who can't get along. I live between my left arm, which is swift and sinister, and my right, which is righteous. I live between a laugh and a scowl, and voted against myself, a two-party system. My left leg dawdled or danced along, my right cleaved to the straight and narrow. My left shoulder was like a stripper on vacation. My right stood upright as a Roman soldier. Let's just say that my left side was the organ donor, and leave my private parts alone. But as for my eyes, which are 2 shades of brown, well, Dionysus, meet Apollo. Look at Eve raising her left eyebrow while Adam puts his right foot down. No one expected it to survive, but divorce seemed out of the question. I suppose my left hand and my right hand will be clasped over my chest in the coffin, and I'll be reconciled at last. I'll be whole again. This is called a partial history of my stupidity. You get to be a certain age and you just can't do the whole thing anymore. So this is like volume 3, chapter 5. Traffic was heavy coming off the bridge, and I took the road to the right, the wrong one, and got stuck in the car for hours. Most nights I rushed out into the evening without paying attention to the trees, whose names I didn't know, or the birds, which flew heedlessly on. I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along, like a tiger that wanted to spring, but was still afraid of the wildness within. The iron bars seemed invisible to others, but I carried a cage around inside me. I cared too much what other people thought and made remarks I shouldn't have made. I was silent when I should have spoken. Forgive me, philosophers. I read the Stoics, but never understood them. I felt that I was living the wrong life, spiritually speaking. While halfway around the world, thousands of people were being slaughtered, some of them by my countrymen. So I walked on, distracted, lost in thought, and forgot to attend to those who suffered far away, nearby. Forgive me, faith, for never having any. I did not believe in God, who eluded me. This is an elegy for my father, who was a box salesman. He liked special orders rather than standard orders because he got paid more. And also it was more imaginative for him because he could design the boxes himself. So this is called special orders. Give me back my father. Walking the halls of Wertheimer Box and Paper Company with sawdust clinging to his shoes. Give me back his tape measure and his keys, his drafting pencil and his order forms. Give me his daydreams on lined paper. I don't understand this uncontainable grief. Whatever you had that never fit, whatever else you needed, believe me, my father, who wanted your business, would squat down at your side and sketch you a container for it. Called Troubadour Song. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and hummed a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. I dreamed I mounted a horse along an empty beach where we galloped far away till I was out of reach. We trotted past the lighthouse abandoned on the dunes and paused by a small stable that was now in ruins. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and made a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. We rode to the starkest edge of nowhere by the sea. The horse was all that remained of what I'd longed to be. We had somewhere deep to rest and nothing left to see, and so the two of us walked into the cemetery. I woke this winter morning to the smell of the sea and sang a song for nothing, how nothing came to me. I've written a book-length poem for my son Gabriel, an elegy. It's all one thing, but I just thought I'd read you a few sections from it. the population of his feelings could not be governed by the authorities. He had reasons why reason disobeyed him and voted him out of office. Anxiety, his constant companion, made it difficult to rest. Unruly party of one, forget about truces or compromises, the barricades will be stormed. Every day was an emergency. Every day called for another emergency meeting of the cabinet. In his country there were scenes of spectacular carnage. Hurricanes welcomed him. He adored typhoons and tornadoes, furies unleashed, houses lifted up and carried to the sea, uncontained, uncontainable. Unbolt the doors, fling open the gates. Here he comes, chaotic wind to the gods. He was trouble, but he was our trouble. Mr. Impulsive walked out of class when he did not like what the teacher said. It was boring. Mr. Impulsive scurried out in a storm wearing shorts and a wife beater. Soon he was shivering. The neighbors complained to the landlord, complained to me, but Mr. Impulsive could not be bothered to close the gate. Mr. Impulsive left the house without his keys. I don't know how many times he camped out on the front stoop. One night he convinced a neighbor to shimmy the lock with a credit card. He was never locked out again. Mr. Impulsive will not be sleeping at home. He'd rather stay out and crash wherever he finds himself at 5 a.m. He could be oddly well-mannered to the parents of his friends. He was usually welcome. From the notebook of Mr. Impulsive. It is better to sneak through a side door than to wait in line like a sucker. It is not necessary to get directions. It's much better to head out right now. Time doesn't matter. These were the antics of Mr. Impulsive, who never knew where he was going until he got there. From the storybook of bluster and bad judgment, from the annals of loneliness, from the history of kids he met on the street in special programs. It was dangerous to stay in Amherst. Lord of misadventure, I'm scared of rounding him up and turning him into a story. God of scribbles and erasures, I hope he shines through like a Giacometti portrait. I keep scraping the canvas and painting him over again, but he keeps slipping away. He was like a spider preyed on by other spiders and older insects. Sweet venom, his arrivals were swift and his departures sudden. I couldn't understand how he lifted the shower door right off its hinges. When Gabriel cooked, the flames rose too high and the fire alarm sounded. When the fire alarm sounded, he tore it off the wall and left the wires dangling. He liked to kick back and remember the time we were riding home in a taxi cab on the West Side Highway and my mother offered to take him to a strip club for his 21st birthday. What's wrong with that, she wanted to know. Why couldn't they celebrate together? That's just what you want, he bellowed, going for a lap dance with Grandma. He liked to kick back and declare he wanted to track down his birth mother to see if he really had Celtic blood. He liked to kick back and tell my family about the time he saw an American Hasidic Jewish reggae musician at Hampshire College. He saw Nicolas Cage going up an escalator in a movie theater and turned to his friends. I hate Nicolas Cage. He has such a big head. He liked to kick back and tell us how much he liked weed and shrooms. How bad could it be for you, he said. It comes out of the ground. He liked to kick back and roll a spliff with his friends at night. He always liked to go higher and higher. We're here, he'd say, lifting his hand to the middle of his chest. But we need to go here, he continued on, and raised his hand up to his neck. Friedrich Rucker wrote 425 poems after his two youngest children died from scarlet fever within 16 days of each other. In 1833 and 1834, he could not cope and often thought they had gone out for a while, They'll be home soon, he told himself to tell his wife. They're only taking a long walk. Mahler scored 5 of those poems in 1901 and 1904 for a vocalist and an orchestra to break your heart. As soon as I heard the plaintive oboe and the descending movement of the horn and the lyric baritone entering, I felt I should not be listening to Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing Kinder Totenlieder with the Berlin Philharmonic. Mahler's wife was superstitious and thought he was chancing disaster with songs on the death of children. Now the sun wants to rise so brightly as if nothing terrible had happened overnight. The tragedy happened to me alone. Mahler knew he could never have written them after his 4-year-old daughter died from scarlet fever 3 years later. He said he felt sorry for himself, that he needed to write these songs, and for the world that would listen to them. When I'm standing in line at the DMV and the stoner next to me starts ranting about his parole officer, the dude has anger management issues. He's profiling me. I couldn't get there because my grandmother was sick. When his buddy rolls into Big Nick's wearing cargo shorts and an Oscar the Grouch t-shirt, and I slip him a $50 bill. When one of his goofball friends swears he will never take hard drugs again, and then drops 3 tabs of acid and winds up in an institution in Tennessee. When I recite Surprised by Joy, Impatient as the Wind, and think about Wordsworth's daughter Catherine, his 6-year-old son Thomas, his daughter Dora, whose death caused him to quit. When someone's nephew, someone's brother's oldest son, a drunken teenager, gets stuck on the railroad tracks. When I see fresh-faced soldiers hurrying off the plane in Atlanta and everyone begins to clap. When the truck swerves into my lane. When lightning strikes a tree while I'm walking across a field. When the young anesthesiologist puts a needle into my arm and I start to go under. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its jagged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves. Though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief. I am not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. I'm just going to close with one more poem. It's called God and Me. I think the title's funny. Other people don't think so. The stars look like a broken belt glittering over the lakes and mountains. The moon looks like a tilted crown. Down here, there's a whole lot of racket in churches and bedrooms. Some good folks are speaking in tongues and raising the rafters. I wonder if the Lord ever gets tired of so much flattery from the fundamentalists. He probably likes it better than all the complaints and entreaties. I'm standing up to listen, but he has nothing to say to the atheists. It would be nice to believe that heaven is like a schoolyard in which everyone gets chosen, even the laggards. My friends are seekers and exiles who won't desert the stories. Me, I can't give him up, but I can't believe in him either. It's a one-sided relationship, I without thou. He has whole galaxies to worry about. I don't suppose he gets too worked up. My puny self is more real to me than his immense non-being. I'm a tiny void with attributes, with my own little river of tears. But what is he who fills the world with trees and stars and leaves us alone with our wars and atrocities, our deadly human nature, our sad dominion over the fish and the fowl? Look, no one knows why there's so much silence in the upper spheres and so much suffering down here. The Almighty skipped over our houses. Thank you.
If you have your questions ready for Emily and for Edward, they will answer them for you. And then Roy is here selling books.
Okay, Emily, come on. Questions, complaints? Same goes for Jennifer.
Let's go there.
When you first started writing, I take it you were young. How long did it take you to get into a rhythm and set a schedule for yourself to write?
When we first started writing, I mean, as kids, that's funny to think of it as a schedule.
No. As kids, I wouldn't think that you did. But as adults, as you got serious.
Well, let me answer this way. When I don't know how you were, Emily, but when I started writing poetry, I was in high school, and it's really generous to call what I was writing poetry. Really, I was just overwhelmed by feelings I couldn't understand.
Right.
The way a lot of kids start writing poetry, and I just started writing, and it made me feel better. Also, girls liked it. I did notice. So that's what I was doing. But I really couldn't call what I was doing poetry. But I went to college. I met my freshman humanities teacher. I went to school in Iowa, a place called Grinnell College, and I brought my poems to her, and she did a remarkable thing for me. She said that, you could be a poet. You have the talent and the imagination and the intelligence to be a poet, but what you're writing are not poems. Because you're just writing down your feelings. If you want to be a poet, you need to try and make something. And to do that, you need to read other poetry. And so I'd say the schedule, I wouldn't call it a schedule, I'd say I began to read. And when I began to read and imitate what I was reading, I wasn't a good poet, but I started trying to become a poet rather than a person who was just writing things down. And that's when I became serious, I'd say, about having a vocation. Because I fell in love with reading poetry and I wanted to be amongst my models. And I realized to do that I needed to try and do something on the page, not just emote. And so I wouldn't say it was a schedule, like I'd do a certain number of hours a day, but I was serious about giving myself over to this art. Is that a parallel?
Well, I started very late. I just never thought that I could be a poet, that it could be. I never even considered it a vocation for myself. I didn't come from any kind of literary family or really the first person in my family to go to college, and this was just not anything that I thought was available to me. I've always loved literature and always had a gift for English classes and excelling in that and writing and mostly prose, but it just didn't occur to me that this was for me, that I could do this. And many years later, a friend of mine was taking a poetry workshop at the 92nd Street Y and encouraged me to go with him. And I did, and I remember my first teacher was Alfred Korn. He was a taskmaker. And I did very well in that workshop. I mean, I just,
Yeah, he likes meter.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear of it? There's something used to be called meter.
Something. And he really didn't have anything good to say about anything in the class except, Alfred Korn. And I read something, and he sat there and he just said one word. He said, impressive. That was it. But for Alfred Korn, that was a big and he was the one who pulled me over and said, you know, you have a gift for poetry. Did you know that? And I said, no. And he said, well, I think you should pursue it. And so I was you know, a late bloomer, and he encouraged me. I think you really need someone to give you permission.
Teacher helps.
Yeah.
Teacher helps.
Teacher helps enormously.
And
So
reading other people's work is really the most important.
Well, that's mostly where you go to school. You mostly go to school on other poets. You can't always have a workshop with you. You can't always have a teacher saying this is good and this isn't good. But you can go to poets you admire and see how they do it and try and figure it out. I mean, it is there for you. The whole history of poetry is there for
It's
you.
there for me. I read voraciously. I know.
Well, that's
Yes,
the key.
fabulous.
You read, and then you try and pick up something from what you've read.
Fabulous stuff.
Thank you. You both were talking about.
How do you avoid capturing what you read and making it your own, and it's really, therefore, not totally authentic or original?
Well, that's hard. I mean, you need to learn from your models, but you can't be your models. I mean, Bloom, Harold Bloom has a more, an anxiety-ridden idea of our core, our Freudian struggle with our precursors. I mean, you have to find something that sounds your own, that's not theirs. Otherwise, you're just completely writing the poems of Rilke or the poets.
Yeah.
There was an interview with Frank Bedard in his collected poems, and he said something that has always stuck me, and that stuck with me.
Yeah, right.
Yes, I knew I could get it. It's that he said that at a certain point he realized that it wasn't his job to write the poems of Milton or of Robert Lowell or of Allen Ginsberg or Elizabeth Bishop. It was his job to write his own poems, no matter how much he admired them. And I think you need to go to school on other poets, but at a certain point you also become resigned. And you say, this is the poetry that I have to write because I'm the only one who's had my experience. I'm the only one who sees the world in which I see it. And if I want to leave a trace of what it felt like to be me, of what I experienced, some minor of what I felt, I need to try and get it down. And so it's not and ever since then, I thought, I'd love to be Keats, but it's not my job to be Keats, to write those poems. It's my job to write the poems that I can write, but I can learn from Keats. I mean, there's never been a great poet in the history of poetry who's not also been a great reader of poetry. But being a great reader doesn't necessarily make you a great poet. You also need to write your own poems. And I think that's what you try to do. You become resigned.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is my gratitude to both of you for helping me schlep around my own bag of concrete. And my question is emotion ever recollected in tranquility?
Is what?
Is emotion ever recollected in tranquility?
Oh.
I mean, it may be for some people. I mean, Wordsworth wasn't making it up. I mean, I think he felt that was
Good
true.
question.
I mean, I think it's Wordsworth. He was kind of a cold person, I think. A great poet, but kind of a cold person. And although Surprised by Joy, that I quote from, is one of the great sonnets in the English language, a heartbreaking sonnet. It's a poem where he sees something. He's so overwhelmed. He sees something that's so beautiful. He feels ecstatic, and he turns to tell his daughter about it. And then he realizes she's dead, and she's not there. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind. And then he realized, how could he ever have joy again? It's a tremendous poem. Clearly, Wordsworth felt there was a certain emotional distance that was necessary. I would say that tranquility is not in my particular vocabulary of writing poetry, but I will say this. In my opinion, there's something cold in writing poetry, even when it's really passionate. Even the most heated poetry, there's something cold in us as poets, because you need a certain distance in order to make something. If you're writing a diary, a red heart diary, it's one thing. But if you're shaping a poem into something, no matter how intense the poem, the operations of poetry also come into it. And you are thinking about poetry, not just about grief. You're thinking about how to shape something. I wouldn't call that tranquil. I find it quite intense. It's not a cerebral activity, but it is an activity that's different than just grieving. It is writing something. I wouldn't say it's tranquil, but it is something different than just experience something as a person. And I mean, I think every poet has a moment of feeling a certain revulsion at trying to take experience and other people in your own life and turning it into poetry, because you are doing something. You are violently doing something, and you are violating something by doing it. I tried to get that. There's a moment in my poem about Gabriel where I go, Lord in misadventure, forgive me for trying to sum him up and turning him into a story. He's not a story, he's a person. But what am I going to do if I'm writing a poem about a person? I'm turning it into a story. You have to do that. So I think there's something in us that is a little bit remote or a little more distant than just the experience in person. And I think that's a saving grace for poets. It's not tranquil, but it is something else.
Thank you.
It's sort of related to that. If you have a unitheme book and it has a downward pull by the nature of the theme, must you always at the end rise up to some kind of hope or consolation or something that gives the reader some way out of it, some way up?
No.
Thank you.
You can if you want to. I mean, I tried to write an inconsolable poem. That's the part of it that's most consoling to people who are going through a lot of grief. That's what they respond to the most. Most elegies are consoling. I mean, that is the nature of a poem of mourning and consolation is the elegiac form. But I think you should only do that if you authentically believe that.
That's right.
If you want to, I mean, to turn towards something hopeful, I think is a marvelous thing if you feel it. And if you don't feel it, I don't think you should feel the obligation. It's not your job to comfort the reader. It's your job to write a poem that's true to experience. And if your experience has some joy in it, then the joy should be part of it. And if it's not, and if you feel inconsolable, then you should write something inconsolable. I mean, one of the oddities about poetry is that the most inconsolable and lonely poems make people feel better.
Yes, exactly true.
Because they feel befriended. They feel companioned by poetry. When John Clare writes, I am, yet what I am none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. When John Clare writes that, we don't feel more desolate.
No.
We feel companioned by him, that he was brave enough to write about loneliness. And also, there is something, I will say one other thing about this. There is something hopeful about poetry, even if you feel hopeless. And the thing that's hopeful about it is that poetry does imply a reader. It's not like just writing a diary to yourself. You are making something that will stand apart from you, you hope. And that does suggest another person, some other relationship towards some future reader. And I think that's hopeful, because it means that experience can be transformed in some kind of way, embodied in something that's apart from you. It's not your job to try and make someone feel better. It's your job to try and, write about experience as you understand it, and to be true to your experience. And by doing that, people will feel comforted, because it's true.
People sometimes refer to poetry as the art of honesty, to be honest, with what is happening, with what it feels like to be you. And so that's, terrible things have happened in my life. I went to Emily Dickinson at her most mournful, and I felt consoled.
Yeah, you feel befriended.
Yeah, befriended.
She herself felt that way. She talks about reading poetry, and she refers to her kinsman of the shelf.
Yeah, that's right.
And people make a lot out of her loneliness. But when you read her letters, you see that she feels companioned by other poets.
Oh, yeah.
She wants to be in the company of Shakespeare and Charlotte Bronte
Yes.
and other poets.
I understand the emotional distance necessary to craft a poem about something like grief. Are there special requirements for being able to orally deliver such a poem? How do you maintain the emotional distance to be able to read such a poem?
For me, it's only recently that I've begun to read it all from Gabriel.
Yeah.
And there was a year where I didn't go out in public at all. I wasn't only reading from Gabriel, I wasn't reading from anything. I just couldn't appear. I canceled everything for a year. Then I wrote the book, and then I decided to publish it, and then it was published, and then I felt strong enough to read it. I think that's personal. Some people never get strong enough. It's not necessary to read it in public. Some people decide along the way, maybe I should read it or not. That's really up to you as a poet. And if you don't think you should do it, no one's going to make you.
I did want to address something that was said before about how can you write out of, what was the question again, Liz?
You write without joy at the end.
If you have a
Do you have to
theme,
turn?
No, the lady, she said, can you write without feeling?
Is emotion
Emotion,
ever-
yes,
No,
that,
tranquility. Can you ever have emotion recollected in tranquility?
I don't, when I've written poems that are very sad, I'm not drenched in sadness, I'm not. But a funny thing happened, my poems right now are being translated into a Spanish bilingual book in Spain, and I have a brilliant translator, and she just does wonderful work. And I don't speak Spanish, but with the English on the other side of the page, I can make it out. And so she sends the poems back to me in Spanish with the English. And this is years after I've written certain poems, and I read them, and I'm very emotional. Whether this is the Spanish language, because it's very passionate, all those beautiful vowels and so on, I don't know, but it's my poem, but I didn't really feel that way writing it in English. So I guess we keep our emotions tamped down in order to bring that poem to life.
And maybe also the poem holds the emotion, and then sometimes you go and revisit it, even if you...
It sometimes feels like it's somebody else's poem, you know, you're reading someone else's poem.
I often think, God, that dude is sad.
That's why I always try to go into those music poems, because they're a little happier. I don't want them to think I'm so
Sad dude. Sorry to be acquainted with him, it really brings me down.
Maybe that's where the catharsis comes in,
Yeah.
where versus writing it as a diary, maybe that's not healing in
Right.
any real way. Whereas when you're a poet and you go through that writing, maybe that's where the catharsis.
Maybe there's a moment where it's a relief not just to think about grief, but to think about poetry.
Yeah, there is some,
Something encouraging about trying to make it into something.
yeah, there's a, you're not immersed in it. It is a distance, you do feel a distance. Later on, maybe you sink into it when you read it again, it feels like someone else. Yeah,
Because art is an element of problem solving.
that's right.
You are trying to solve a problem, poetically as well as emotionally.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much. The poets are getting on the 6:10 train, so if you really want someone to sign, please get a book. And we don't have many copies of Emily's books, but they're available on Amazon, so please look for Hostage and Little Savage. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.